There once was a hare who was always boasting of his speed.
"There is no one in the forest who can run as fast as I can,"
he told everyone as he strutted up and down.
"Who wants to race me?"
The other animals were tired of hearing his boasting, but no one ever offered to race him. Until one day, the tortoise spoke up. "I will race with you," he drawled in his slow tones. The hare burst out laughing, and all of the animals looked surprised, for everyone knew that the tortoise was the slowest of them all.
Chuckled the hare. "Oh, that is a good joke. Why, I can beat you without half trying."
"Wait until you have won before you start to boast," said the tortoise. So the race course was laid out, and all of the animals gathered to see the start. The hare bounded off in a great burst of speed that left the poor tortoise far behind in the dust. Soon the hare looked back, finding that he could not even see the tortoise coming anymore. He lay down in the shade of a big tree beside the road to wait a bit, just to make the finish of the race more exciting. But waiting made the hare sleepy, and he decided to snatch just a 2-minute nap. The 2 minutes stretched on, and still the hare slept in the shade of the big tree. All this time, the tortoise was plodding along the hot, dusty road. He came ever so slowly, but he kept right at it. And soon, he passed the hare sleeping by the roadside. The tortoise crawled by without making a sound to wake up the careless hare. When the hare finally woke up with a start, the tortoise was just plodding over the finish line, far ahead, while all of the animals stood by cheering. The hare had lost the race by being careless and cocky. He could never boast again, and all of the animals were glad of that. Once there was a country mouse who lived in a cozy little hole in the floor of the barn. One day, he happily welcomed his cousin from the city who had accepted his invitation to dinner. After they had exchanged pleasantries, they sat down to dinner, and the country mouse gave his city cousin all the best things he had, such as dried peas, beans, and crusts of bread. Now, the town mouse was too polite to show how much he disliked the food, so he picked a little here and tasted a little there. But after dinner, he couldn't help but remark, "I don't see how you can stand such plain food. Why don't you go home with me and get a taste of the delicious things I eat all the time?" Now, the country mouse knew that his city cousin didn't mean to be unkind, so he returned to the city with him. Since they arrived rather late that night, the town mouse took the country mouse at once to a large room where there had been a big banquet. "Now you rest here," said the town mouse, "and I'll bring you some real food." And he brought the country mouse such things as nuts, dates, cake, and fruit. And the country mouse thought it was all so wonderfully delicious that he would like to stay here forever. But as he opened his mouth to tell his city cousin about it, he heard the most awful noise. And then he saw a huge creature dash into the room, and he was just about frightened out of his wits. So he ran from under the table, turning this way and that, trying to find a place to hide. At last, he ran up a curtain, and when he got to the top, he was trembling so badly that the whole curtain shook, and he was afraid he would fall. He looked around the room and couldn't see his cousin anywhere. He only hoped that horrible creature hadn't eaten him up. After a while, everything seemed to be perfectly quiet, and the lights had been turned out in the room, so the country mouse decided to find his way back to his home. When he reached the bottom of the curtain, he looked around, and seeing nothing, he tiptoed across to the door where he and his cousin had come in. After what seemed like a lifetime, the country mouse found his way home. And as he sank down in his warm but shabby little hole under the barn floor, he said, "I'd rather have common food in safety than nuts and dates in danger." Once upon a time, there was a crow, and this crow was a very vain, conceited fellow. At parties, he always showed off by doing tricks, which none of the other birds ever liked. Some even yawned or started conversation during his performance. After a while, this crow became unhappy and lonely because no one would have anything to do with him. So he stayed in his own house and read books on how to make friends. Time passed, and the birds planned the biggest social event of the season. They had committee meetings to make plans for the ball. Some of the men took time from their work to make speeches to organizations, and the women held special meetings of their clubs to discuss decorations. Finally, the crow heard someone discussing the ball, and he began to wonder how he could go and make a hit without anyone knowing who he was. Night after night, he pored over costume books and catalogs which showed dresses of different periods. But he never found one to suit him. It so happened that just one day before the big ball, the crow was out walking in the country when he came upon a whole lot of peacock feathers just lying there. The crow looked quickly around to see if anyone was watching. Then he jerked up the peacock feathers and tucked them under his coat and took them home with him. The next night, the ballroom was crowded by 10 o'clock. The mayor, His Honor Mr. Blue Jay, looked splendid in full dress with a red ribbon across his chest. And his wife, less colorfully dressed than her husband, nevertheless looked charming. Senor and Senora Cardinal were dressed in Spanish style, although it wasn't really known whether they were from Spain or not. Little old Mr. Sparrow and his wife came, looking rather plain and dowdy, but well loved by all. The opera singer, Mademoiselle Canary, looked beautiful, and all the unattached males flocked around her. The town joker, Marcel Mockingbird, who could mimic anyone, was there. Nervous Miss Hummingbird, the kindergarten teacher, flitted from one group to the next, hovering around them, which made some of them slightly nervous, too. All of the big birds came, too, of course, so in waddled Dr. Duck and his plump wife, who couldn't see very well and squinted at everyone. Miss Dove, the most beloved of all the school teachers, came on the arm of Superintendent Owl, who had more degrees than anyone in town. Mr. and Mrs. Swan were there. They were once ballet dancers, you know, and are still wonderfully graceful. The loudmouth of the town showed up, Gus Goose, always cracking jokes and then laughing louder than anyone else. And of course, Prince and Princess Peacock came with all their court. And how splendid they looked. At last, it seemed that everyone was present, and so the grand march began. The orchestra had never played more beautifully, and little Miss Hummingbird was so overcome by it all that Dr. Duck had to administer smelling salts. And then it happened. At the top of the wide stairs appeared the conceited crow, all decked out in the peacock feathers he had found. Shock and dismay were plainly visible on the faces of all as they stared at the ridiculous sight of Mr. Crow trying to pass himself off as a peacock. Dr. Duck kept the smelling salts bottle at the ready. Prince and Princess Peacock looked indignant, and their privy council hastily thumbed through his vest pocket law book to see what the penalty was for impersonating a peacock. It was indeed a tense moment. The music had dwindled away as the members of the orchestra stood up to get a better view. And believe it or not, the conceited crow marched down the stairs and in among the gaping guests. Since he thought that he looked exactly like a peacock, he approached the court of the prince and princess. The princess turned her head away, and the prince loudly exclaimed, "You are not of this court! Begone!" And the crow looked so surprised and shocked that when the other peacock started pulling out his false plumes, he didn't seem to know what was happening. When his last gay but borrowed plume was gone, the crow slunk off to where all the other crows were standing, but they all turned their backs on him, except their leader, Andy Crow, who raised his hand and said in a loud voice, "Caw, caw! Fine feathers do not make fine birds, and it is foolish to be proud of borrowed plumes. Go, conceited crow, and consider what you have done." And so the poor, vain, conceited crow walked slowly out of the ballroom. This event happened a long time ago, and I understand that Mr. Crow learned his lesson and is now accepted in all the social circles.